We entitled today, I think, Fresh Updates, Wi-Fi 6, mGig, Backbones. And so, I don't get a chance to talk to everybody every month, but the reality is the ball of technology continues to roll down the hill. So we want to take a chance as we kind of kick off our summer series, just to kind of get up to speed with what's going on in the industry, and what you can kind of orient your minds around as far as from a planning perspective when it comes to your technology. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get things started. So I'm a little excited, mostly because I feel like this is a bit of a different opportunity for me, especially as it relates to Wi-Fi 6. I gave not this particular presentation, but a presentation around Wi-Fi 6 about 2 years ago now, maybe 3, when Wi-Fi 6 was still like a new and developing technology for us. And so we almost get this chance to kind of look back and say, how did that go? How did we get here? What were we excited for before? Does that feel like it materialized? And I know not everybody has made that jump yet. We're still in a transition to Wi-Fi 6. But I'm imagining a lot of this early information, at least, won't be new to some of you, just a bit of a refresher. So let's recap a bit. I've had this slide for a while, and I just like it because it kind of shows where we've come from. Wireless is complicated, right? There's a bunch of different, we're trying to manage signal levels and propagation that's getting in the way of our signal strength and coverage. And we started out with, maybe 2 devices in the environment, and now I'm up to 200, it feels like, or more. We started out with low throughputs. You look at 1999 Wi-Fi 1, 11 megs, and now with the Wi-Fi 6 standard, 9.6 gigs, and that's theoretical throughput, but that's a 1,000x improvement over the course of 20 years. So there's some incredible electromagnetic engineers, electrical engineers working on this technology and these standards, and we have come a long way. And what you're going to hear me talk about today is this concept of wired-like performance. Even going back 10 years, Wi-Fi 4, it always felt just a little too slow to use, predictably, constantly. Wi-Fi 5 gave us a big jump forward from that, and a lot of us probably rely pretty heavily on Wi-Fi. There's still this bent to kind of, when you're crunched for performance, let's go ahead and plug in. Let's do that. In 2019, I sat at Cisco Live. I think the last time they had it in person. We're going to do that again here in a month or so. But they talked about this shift and looking for wireless first, because we're closing the gap so much to wired-like performance that if I don't need a wire, then I'm not going to use it. And that preference exists tremendously in the market. So we talked a couple years ago about, the adoption plan, and we were thinking kind of 2 to 3 years out would be the sweet spot where people start to acquire Wi-Fi 6 capable endpoints, your devices that are connecting to your access points, and then also Wi-Fi 6 access points. So I know the pandemic and supply chain issues, have put a wrench into things, but we're still very much moving down that path of full Wi-Fi 6 adoption. So for those of you that haven't adopted it yet, let's talk about just a few of the top reasons. Right, number one, which we're always going after, is higher capacity. Can I move things faster? But along with that, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but is improved security. That has risen, especially over the past 10 years, to become essential, critical when we're talking about networks. Is, can I securely operate these networks? And so there's some advantages in moving to Wi-Fi 6. Reduced latency. This is one of the big ones as I push towards a wired-like performance, especially for sensitive traffic like voice and video, which you may have noticed we use a lot more over the past couple of years. So that kind of reduced latency, and I like what they put on this slide, deterministic scheduling. It's just maybe even more so than reduced latency, it's just predictable latency and consistent latency. And we can work with that, right? If it's predictable and consistent, I can work with that. Power efficiency, greater IoT scale, improved interference mitigation, all these kind of factors come together. And there's a laundry list of technologies that are implemented with this new Wi-Fi 6 standard that push us forward in all of these directions. One I want to highlight, though, because I think it's a big chunk of it, and that is this concept of OFDMA. Now, maybe you've heard this before. If you heard my last talk, I did talk about this and use this slide. I like this one because it illustrates in Wi-Fi 5, we have these time slots that we're able to send traffic. And this is the OFDM standard. And I'm able to send from one user, you can see on the right-hand side here, user 1 sending some kind of telemetry data, and then user 2 goes, and then user 3 goes, and then user 4 goes, and all this kind of stuff. And they're able to transmit. But this graph is a little misleading because it makes it look like they're sending data for the entirety of that time slot. But the reality is quite different. You know, especially as I look at like user 2 over here, he's sending voice. He's just sending a little packet. So if I were to superimpose that over on OFDM, I'm only using maybe 80% of the data that I could be transmitting during that time slot. So the 80% that he doesn't use just goes to waste, which is kind of too bad. And as we have this crunch of more and more and more devices that are trying to talk and trying to get communications out there, that inefficiency really starts to crop up. Now, it's not to say it's the end of the world. We've used Wi-Fi 5 for a while. It does a pretty good job, but there are some incredible efficiencies that come in with OFDMA as part of Wi-Fi 6. And many of us have probably experienced this without knowing it. Wi-Fi, or I should say cellular technology, has used something similar to this for a while. So I know I've been in a, even if it's been a while, a crowded space, a stadium. You're leaving for the night, or it's just halftime or something like that, and you get on your phone, and you're connected to the Wi-Fi, but anything you load isn't going anywhere. It's dog slow, right? And so I think we've just kind of learned instinctively, well, I'm gonna flip over to cellular and give that a try, and all of a sudden, whoop, I'm connected, and I'm sending traffic back and forth, no problem. Probably everybody else is doing that too, right? I've got a huge number of users in that space. But cellular has relied on this kind of OFDMA type of technology, so they can sneak little packets in here in these time slots and divide these up into more granular slots that really just allow us to get traffic through. So for the VoIP user, the voice user, instead of sending one small packet in time slot 2, he gets to send a small one in time slot 2, another one in 4, another one in 6, another one in 8. You can see kind of the predictability of this traffic stabilize and gets us a lot closer to that kind of wire-like performance. It also just means we're using a lot more of the airspace around us. We're being much more efficient with it, which is a big differentiator as we shift, and where we get a lot of those performance gains as we shift to Wi-Fi 6. So if I can advance here. One of the things we've noticed with Wi-Fi 6, and one of the things that works so well is Wi-Fi 6 follows the rules, and apologies for the metaphors around children or something, but I've got 4 at home that are 6 and under, so this is a bit of my life. Wi-Fi 6 follows the rules very diligently. In this picture, right, I got one speaker, that person's talking, everybody else is being quiet, at least in theory. It looks nice and peaceful from the picture. And that is exactly how Wi-Fi 6 operates, in contrast to some previous ones. I think about it as like a talking stick, right? I'm going to assign different clients to talk at different intervals, and all of that is scheduled and nice and orderly. The problem is my Wi-Fi 5 clients don't operate that way. They just shout it out. Hey, I got something to say. I'm going to get on the RF spectrum and start sending my traffic right away. And so one of the things we talked about a few years ago was there's going to be this shift as we move from 5, devices that are Wi-Fi 5 over to Wi-Fi 6, where if I've got too many of these, these crazies, we'll say, in my environment, then the Wi-Fi 6, the nice rule followers in the room, are going to have a harder time getting those gains in that we've talked about from a performance perspective. And so this is a problem, especially as we add more and more devices. So you look at the spectrum here. we can kind of separate devices out into, different channels between APs and everything. But look at 2.4 here. I've got three 20 megahertz channels. And I can get more performance, with the larger channels that I go to, 40, 80, 160. What we started with just three, I should say, non-overlapping channels. You can kind of, if you've studied Wi-Fi at any particular point, there's intermediate channels, but we steer away from those because we don't want to have overlapping channels. And so I got three on 2.4. I got a lot more when we moved to 5 gigahertz, and that was fantastic. The problem was, like 80%, this huge swath in the middle is covered by something called DFS, which I meant to look up, frankly. I think it's dynamic frequency switching, or somebody can put that in the chat if they know better. What it is, though, is like military, legacy military systems, weather radar, this kind of thing operates on this frequency. And so the government came out and said, you can have this frequency, but I need you to, detect if you're operating in this frequency and all of a sudden you see that military system starts transmitting a signal, you need to get out of the way. You need to clear. The military's coming through. And so for a lot of systems, we just stay away from these entirely. Well, that's too bad, because now I go from having, I went from 3 channels to 25. That sounded good. But in reality, if I stay away from these DFS, I got 4 channels here and 5 channels here. I'm at 9. It's a little more, but still not quite enough. I need more channels. Well, good news. We've got Wi-Fi 6E now. And this is the update to Wi-Fi 6. Regulators, the government has approved access to the 6 gigahertz space. They moved some people out of the way that were currently using it. And now look at all these channels that we have to work with from a performance perspective. 59 20 megahertz channels. And those are going to be perfect for some little IoT devices that just need to transmit a little bit here and a little bit there. But then we also get access to 160 megahertz channels, which can really drive some, bandwidth intensive applications. I can give them that space. I haven't had any of those channels that exist outside the DFS previously. Now I've got 7. So we get this, this is the evolution, if you will, of Wi-Fi 6 is into Wi-Fi 6E, where we now have access to this new RF spectrum where we can send transmissions from. And you can see how much more real estate I have to work with in this 6 gigahertz space. So there is a bit of a new king of the hill from a wireless perspective. Here we are with this chart again, 6 and 6E. I liked how they presented it here because you just see this blue kind of overlap. And the apologies if you're the lawnmower outside. And the beautiful part of this is all the technologies that we talked about in Wi-Fi 6 exist in 6E. It's not necessarily an upgrade of the protocol with new features and functionalities and all that kind of stuff. We're just extending that capability into the 6 gigahertz spectrum. So in that little depiction of kindergarten, I don't have everybody shouting out and trying to get their own. They're trying to interject and interrupting the Wi-Fi 6 clients. What this gives me, and I like this picture, instead of having a highly trafficked area that I'm trying to, get through the traffic jam of, I've got this pristine road, which is Wi-Fi 6, or is the 6 gigahertz space, I should say, that's giving me access to all those, Wi-Fi 6 goodness that I'm after. No surprise, we've got a few new products that coincide with this, and that's because to access the 6 gigahertz frequency, you need a new radio. So you can see in this chart here, I've got my 2.4 still. I can still service those clients. I've got my 5 gigahertz. I can still service those clients, but I have this new 6 gigahertz radio. So they just added more on, and I got to hold one of these. It is pretty hefty. There is a lot of there's a lot of metal in these things. So there's a lot of juice coming out of them. They also include, and as we shift to a wireless first redundancy, wireless first, future, redundancy becomes an issue. So they actually allow for 2 of these redundant mGig PoE ports. So you can cross connect them between 2 switches, for example, maybe that are in a stack or in a chassis or something like that. and gain redundancy. So if I lose one of those switches, I still have PoE being sourced from one of those switches, and I haven't lost things. And so, again, this is just kind of a push to this wireless first future where that becomes almost the first edge, the first connection point into the network, and then we go to the switches from there. So, not to be outdone, this is the Cisco Catalyst 9136 for those of you that are using 9800 controllers and Cisco Catalyst AeroNet APs. We also have a new one, a new access point on the Meraki side, so the MR57. And fascinatingly enough, I'm just going to go back and forth between these. Look at that AP. Look at that AP. Look at that AP. Look at that AP. That's the same AP. These are, and Cisco's pushing in this direction somewhat to give some flexibility to management. But hardware-wise, you're looking at the same AP. So that tradition, of incredible reliability of the Cisco access points continues to evolve and pushes into the Meraki space. We're just running Meraki software on these. But all the same things apply, right? I've got my dual 5 gig, 6 gigahertz spectrums on here, my dual 5 gig ports, and you can even see what those look like on the backside. Also, just kind of nice from an installation perspective. If you're coming from a 2702, 3802, or 2802, 3702, 3802, the same kind of universal mount for the Cisco APs that have been in place for 10, 15 years at this point are going to be reusable. So swapping out, from existing APs will work pretty well, whether you're swapping to this, again, it's the same AP, hardware-wise, or to the Meraki MR57. We'll be able to do that pretty simply, hopefully. All right, one little note about 6E. So I said we're gaining access to the 6 gigahertz spectrum. For my international customers on the call, we do have caveats with that, because the reality is the United States did that, along with some other countries, Brazil, Chile, South Korea. This chart's actually like a year old at this point, but it gave some nice color coding, so it conveys the idea. Europe, though, in particular, still kind of navigating that. A lot of them have offered half of that 6 gigahertz spectrum. So if I try and reverse course here quickly, a lot of them have, include about half of this. We still get a ton more channels, but it's something to be aware of if you're ordering or doing some planning around, 6E in those international markets. Not all countries are equal, since this is, regulators and the government that is making space for 6 gigahertz. All right. So let's move on to, what do you plug these access points into? And we talked about this previously as well, and I've probably had this conversation with many of you. But if I'm getting faster and faster and more bandwidth out of my APs, then something kind of needs to happen on the switch side, right? For a long time, we've had gigabit connections. And so the problem is, as we start to exceed that gigabit link, I need to come up with a new access method. Well, Cisco saw this coming, and they worked in partnership with the IEEE to come up with a new standard known as multi-gig. So you can see that lovely animation there, where we go from 1 gig all the way to 2.5 or 5 or even 10 gig potentially, which gives us that extra throughput that we will need from servicing all these clients. We'll talk a little bit about that going forward. But like I said, it was built in concert with the IEEE. So it is an industry standard at this point. Devices, should support that from a standards perspective. And there's a couple different speed options when it comes to mGig. 10 megs has gotten left behind. Sorry, all those devices that still operate at 10 megs. We can't support that anymore. But 100 megs, 1 gig. And then we have these new specs as far as 2.5, 5 gig, even 10 gig capable across your copper lines. Now, the good news is most everything we see at this point maxes out at 5 gig. For example, like 9120s, just this goes Wi-Fi 6 kind of standard, has a 2.5 gig port. We felt like that would be sufficient for the traffic you'd be connecting there. 9130s, the new 9136, the MR57 that I just showed, have 5 gig ports on the back end. I'm not really seeing at this point devices that support 10 gig. We just don't think that, you connect a bunch of clients and you're going to exceed that 5 gig space at this point. And if you did with a 9136 on the Wi-Fi 6E standard, we've got dual connections to get us to that 10 gig space. But what I want to emphasize here is that Cat5e cabling, because cabling is going to become important as part of this transition as well, supports standard length, 300 feet, on the 5 gig throughput rating. Once you try and push 10 gig, then Cat5e starts to fall away. But for the next several years, certainly, as long as you have at least Cat5e deployed in your environment, there's no considerations from a cabling perspective that it's going to support up to 5 gigs. So let's look at some of the products. Now these are out here. We've deployed lots of these already. Some of you probably have them. But for those of you that haven't seen them, these are the Cisco Catalyst 9300s. Meraki's very similar. You get into a 24-port switch, and it's an mGig capable switch. They also have gigabits, but let's focus on the mGig for now. These ports, all 24 of them, will operate at 2.5, 5, and 10 gig. This other 24 port operates at 2.5, 5, and 10 gig. But then you start to get into the 48 ports, and we're pushing a whole lot of traffic at this point. So the ASICs behind it and everything are trying to do some balancing. This UXM comes with the first 36 ports are 2.5, and then the last 12 are up to 10. So, that could work really well. Just something to be aware of when you're installing these. If you're connecting to like 9136, I'd like to cable those into these last 12 ports. Now, I'm a keep it simple person, so I really like this switch, the 48UN, which just all the ports are 5. So no muss, no fuss. I don't need to think about it. Just plug it in wherever you want, and you're going to get at least 5 gigs out of it, which, like I said, the APs, that's largely where they're at. If you got a couple, 10 gig capable servers or something like that, then maybe the UXM is a little bit better choice because we can go all the way up to that speed. A couple of the options. Now, this is the 9300 switch. We also have some lesser switches in the hierarchy. So this is the 9300L. The only thing to be aware of when we're looking at these, and my team is always happy to walk through this with you, but that we generally end up with fewer mGig capable ports. So in this case, I've got 10 gig or 12 ports, for example, on each one of these switches. I look at the 24 port version, and now there's 8 mGig ports. That may be sufficient for the number of APs that are connected in the closet. I'm not really looking at connecting endpoints at this time. With mGig ports, it's really all about the APs. But we just want to be aware of, one, where those ports lie. And you can kind of see them highlighted in blue here on the bottom, right? So these last 8 ports are going to be mGig capable. These last 12 ports are going to be mGig capable. That's kind of etched into the switch physically. But as we look at those switches, it's not going to be all 48. It's not going to be all 24. We're targeting kind of those last few ports there. And we'll do some planning around, do we have sufficient ports? All right. So let's see if I can twist some arms on this mGig conversation. I know some of you said you're not sure. This is not intended to be a sales pitch, but I do see, just more and more traffic kind of coming through. And so this was a little test that Cisco put together. So you can see down bottom, we have 3 of these IX Chariots. If you heard of, I think it's Ixia, they're traffic generator, it's traffic generator software. So we got 3 of these connected at a gigabit. So you've got basically 3 gigs of source content material that we can push across the wire. We've got a connection to this 9800 controller at 10 gigs. And then we've got a 5 gig connection down to, I believe this was 9130, connected to some clients, both 5 gig and 2.4. So as we've seen and talked about, to mGig or not to mGig, that is the question. So, a gig is still a good amount of traffic. We know that to be the case. But as with all things technology, what used to be good starts to become less good over time, it seems. So they put this test together and started pushing traffic, and these were the results. So, like I said, 3 of these laptops connected at a gig, so we can offer 3 gigs to the environment with 3 over-the-air clients, just 3. I mean, that's kind of the fun part here to me. We're just trying to pull down information as fast as possible from those with those 3 clients. UDP traffic hit 1.8 gigs, and they actually showed another one where it got to 2, and then TCP, which was a little more, stable, we pulled 1.2 gigs. So that is the official test results. You really can drive more than just a gig with each of these. So they gave some graphs here that said, okay, we kind of followed this test up where we were seeing 1.5 gigs with an mGig switch in place, and then we put a gigabit switch in the chain to kind of be that bottleneck that we would typically see with a gigabit switch, and it dropped that traffic down to 870 megs. And so this is where we find that that mGig switching is really needed as that backbone connection. I think of what we've done with switches over time, right? We've shifted to 10 gig backbones because I've got probably 48 ports. Most of those are connected, maybe 40 some devices or something like that connected, and having a 1 gig link back to my core switch just didn't seem like quite enough. I needed a little bit more juice there to push that amount of traffic. Well, we're starting to see that on the wireless side, right? I might have 30, 40 clients connected to an access point, and having a 1 gig backbone back to my switch is, starting to be that bottleneck here. And then they make the final point, this was with Wi-Fi 6. Wait until we get to 6E with 6 gigahertz and those 160 megahertz channels. So this is not even the cream of the crop. So, key takeaways: more than gig on a single AP is possible. Wi-Fi 6E and the 6 gigahertz space is going to drive more yet. Overdriving 1 gig switch port throttles the throughput, right? We saw that drop down to 850 or 870 or so. And mGig kind of removes that bottleneck. I will say I have my own kind of anecdotal test on this. I have Wi-Fi 6 APs at my house, a Meraki MR55s. Actually, it was like the first generation of the Wi-Fi 6 things that they did. And so, and I've got an 800 meg circuit from Comcast. Now, my firewall, unfortunately, throttles at about 500 meg. But when I do a speed test, purely from my iPhone here, so, it's a powerful device, but it's still kind of tiny, and you wouldn't expect it to do too much. I push that firewall every single time, 500 megs. My throughput is not, and that's a single device, right, going out at one time. So you can imagine as you add 20, 30 devices to an access point, and they start pushing, high throughput application traffic, we're going to start to hit that speed. Down the home stretch here. So we've got Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E APs that are pushing a lot more traffic. Behind that, we've got mGig, so we can push more traffic from the AP to the switch. Well, I've got 2.5 and 5 gig ports coming into the switch. It kind of, we've been doing 10 gig backbones for a while. By backbones, I mean, generally fiber connections back to a core switch or something like that. But we might need to think about upgrading those. You can bond, a few 10 gig connections together, and maybe that gives us plenty. But and I've talked to a lot of you about this, but even more than the bandwidth of a full 10 gig being saturated, a lot of times it has to do just with the buffer space, right? It's not that everything flows in, all the packets flow in a nice, even, consistent stream. They jump out and they burst onto the switch. And so the switch has to, in a matter of nanoseconds, buffer all of that information before it can send it out the other, the upstream port. And so in some cases, we're just we need some more of that buffer space basically to handle not so much full 10 gigs worth of capability, but just as more packets are hitting the switch, I need a little bit more ability to manage that. So you might see a new entrant into the field here. We've been talking for years about 10 gig, and then if you go beyond that, 40 gig and 100 gig. But there's this new entrant, 25 gigs. And you can see it's supported across the spectrum here, right? 92, 93, 94, 95, 9600. We've got 25 gig capability. And that becomes attractive for a few reasons. One, it follows this SFP 28 standard, which is the same form factor as the rest of these SFPs, the 1 gig and the 10 gig. So it's the same size, same real estate that gets taken up. Kind of hard to see, but on this 40 gig, it's almost double the width. So that gives us some advantages, just in that we can support on some of these modules both the new 25 gig standard, and then maybe you just have some existing 1 gig, 10 gig connections that still need to remain in place. Well, you're going to have a hard time plugging that into this QSFP port, right? It's a different form factor. But we can support that here. You see SFP and SFP plus transceivers are supported 110.25. So in your environments, when you're in kind of a mixed scenario, but we're trying to get some of our backbone upgraded to 25 gig, we can use these network modules to facilitate that. The other thing is we got to talk about the migration, because if you upgrade your access switches, and I encounter this with a lot of organizations, I'm upgrading the edge, the access layer that services my APs maybe, but I'm not necessarily ready to upgrade my core. So, well, what do you do there? Because you've got 10 gig at the core, but you want to go to 25 gig at the access to kind of future-proof a little bit, right? Well, Cisco introduced this, because it's the same form factor, and I don't know if I've seen this before. This is a dual speed SFP. So it is a 10 gig and a 25 gig. We've got short haul and long haul options for that. What that's going to allow you to do is you do the access layer and you convert that over to 25 gig, but it'll still communicate to your core layer at 10 gig. And then fast forward a couple years and you're ready to upgrade your core. Well, great. Then we'll install 25 gig at the core. And now all of a sudden you've upgraded your backbone speeds to 25 gig. So it kind of eases that migration. They make the point here, right, from 10 gig to 25 gig, because you don't have to do everything simultaneously. Maybe it's reverse. Maybe you're upgrading the core and you're ready to, make that investment and you want to prepare for the future 25 gig, but you're not ready to do the access layer. Well, we can do this kind of dual speed operation. So I wanted to, throw that out there. Obviously, 40 gig and 100 gig, if I go back to this one, is still available if you really expect to, push the envelope on some of this traffic. And there's a case to be made in certain circumstances. Maybe that's the right call. But we also have this kind of interim or intermediate, maybe I should say, option available as well. And I think from a migration perspective, makes a lot of sense.